William Shakespeare has been called the most famous writer of all time. He produced a plethora of works in his life, although the actual number of plays he wrote has been debated, depending on the distinction of contribution, whether he penned them himself or was a co-author. The accepted number of plays totals 38, with 154 sonnets. Producing such a large body of work and the success he enjoyed with his productions is indeed enough to define the man of his times. Yet Shakespeare has transcended his time and wrote plays that speak to all humanity for all time. Did he write with the intuitive knowledge that his work would transcend time, or were his works a product of timing, circumstance, and business savvy? Perhaps this question has no answer. However, one may better understand what drove Shakespeare's unique success by examining certain defining circumstances he faced, his innovative approach to the theater, the competition of the day, and his brilliant business savvy. There are certain circumstances in anyone's life that may have a resounding impact on the way they think. Although it is not possible to know for sure the particular circumstances that influenced Shakespeare, there are distinctive events he endured that may shed some light to his creative process. For example, throughout Shakespeare's lifetime, England was experiencing the Protestant Reformation, which would make his family's Catholic religion illegal. Shakespeare probably had friends and neighbors that were converted or born to Protestantism, making loyalty to God and country hard to define, which in turn may have suggested a different approach to a traditional antagonist-protagonist ideals for young William. One of the defining geniuses of Shakespeare's writing was the unclear ideal of antagonist-protagonist qualities of his characters. The bad guys were never all bad, and the good guys were never all good. There were other examples of defining circumstances that may have influenced Shakespeare's writing. When William was young, his father had successful business ventures that allowed Shakespeare to enjoy some affluence. He was sent to school at the age of 7 and discovered literature and the theater. During this time, Shakespeare's father was the mayor of his town, and his family was well respected. When Shakespeare was 12, his father was arrested for dealing in black market wool. William's father was now considered a criminal, and the family soon went bankrupt. William had to drop out of school and begin a life of hard labor. It's unclear if young William considered his father to be bad when the government decreed him a criminal, or the exact impact to young Shakespeare of his father going bankrupt. Unplanned circumstances can sometimes have a very specific way of defining the resource of artistic expression. When Shakespeare was 18, he found himself an expectant father and had to hastily marry Anne Hathaway. Providing for a family may have been a distinctive influence in Shakespeare developing his unique writing style, sharpening his wit, and digging deep into his artistic resource. Perhaps the most horrific circumstances may have the largest influence on an artist's creativity. When Shakespeare was at the height of his career, his young son Hamlet died. Without the actual experience, one can only imagine the real emotional effect the death of a child might have. Shakespeare's son died when he was writing the sonnets. Understanding his personal tragedy gives a completely different meaning to the quote from Sonnet 33. "But out, alas, he was but 1 hour mine. The region cloud hath masked him from me now. Yet him for this my love no whit disdaineth. Sons of the world may stain when heaven's sun staineth." Artists use their art to express their deepest emotions. It does seem likely that Shakespeare would have done the same. All humans have certain defining circumstances that shape their existence. Perhaps Shakespeare used some of his like colors in a painter's palette, with the deeper experiences bringing forth access to a broader range of color and intensity. In the very beginning of Shakespeare's first play in London, his approach to theater was entirely unique. He developed characters in a way that had never been established. In The Two Gentlemen of Verona, and in certain subsequent plays that followed, he breached the fourth wall, with characters directly speaking to the audience. He brought forth the idea that love conquers all in his comedies. He brought disguises and multiple levels of comedy to the theater, opening access to a broader demographic. He resolved his comedies with happy endings, which may have allowed people to feel inspired in the uncertain times of 16th century England, which reeked of death from the plague. He made the fools of his comedies the catalysts, and often portrayed them as the wisest of the characters, which was perhaps his ultimate irony when he was writing comedy. Shakespeare's innovative approach to theatre quickly gained him much attention in London, including attention from the Queen. He continued his unique style by using nationalism as inspiration in his history plays, and defining the narrow dimension of actual history with deepening his character treatments of historical figures. For example, in Henry V, Shakespeare gave King Henry an emotional depth that may have been entirely created by him. Regardless, it made King Henry's story more compelling, as noted in this excerpt from the infamous St. Crispian Day speech he gave to his army on the brink of battle. Act 4, Scene 2. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. In the play Hamlet, Shakespeare gives the young and brooding Hamlet a depth and dimension that struck a chord with the English audiences, as Hamlet asked the big questions. Shakespeare's tragedies were especially tragic, perhaps best described by English historian Michael Woods. In an age when plays had to compete with public executions, he gave them a theatre of cruelty. In his play King Lear, Shakespeare develops his characters with irony and with the deepest psychological mastery. As the plot of King Lear unfolds, the king ends up naked and ranting, having been betrayed by his two eldest daughters. As England entertained enacting a law deporting all people of African descent, he gave the audiences Othello. In his most popular tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, two lovers from opposite feuding families die unnecessarily in the end, reflecting the potential reality of what resentment and hatred can manifest. In the end of his tragedies, the principal characters usually die with irony and cruelty. Shakespeare's mastery of his craft certainly kept his fortune from turning out very differently than that of his father, and his innovative approach to the theatre kept the audiences coming back for more. Making a definitive argument that Shakespeare would be influenced by his competition may be impossible, although he was most likely influenced by his competitors. In Shakespeare's day, copyrights for plays didn't exist. When Shakespeare arrived in London, the leading playwright at the time was Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe's style was over-the-top dramatic and largely based in history. There have been many theories that Marlowe wrote some of Shakespeare's plays, or that Shakespeare borrowed from different playwrights to complete some of his plays. Upon specific analysis of the works directly attributed to Marlowe and other playwrights of his day, Shakespeare's writing style was different enough to attribute the known works of Shakespeare to him. Shakespeare's Henry VI outperformed Marlowe's biggest hit, The Jew of Malta, and Thomas Kyd's biggest hit, Spanish Tragedy, at the box office. In the 10 years after Shakespeare arrived at the top, new playwrights were producing plays with boys as the main actors. Playwrights like Ben Jonson were writing plays about politics and the law. Shakespeare responded to this competition by producing his masterpiece, Twelfth Night, a comedy. He seemed to create his own box and did not directly compete with the newest fads. Thus was the style of Shakespeare. Fierce competition for money and glamour of being the #1 box office draw arguably drove Shakespeare to write some of his best work. Shakespeare had enacted many firsts in the theater, the modern theater business notwithstanding. Shakespeare and his company of actors had built and owned their very own theater in London, the Globe. This was a first for a theater company, but a practice that still continues to flourish. The Globe is still in London to this day. Arguably, the real genius of Shakespeare's business prowess is in the writing of his plays. Shakespeare wrote for the masses without excluding the privileged few. By including base humor, complicated irony, and characters of depth and humanity, he is sure to keep the audiences coming back for more, time and time again. This uncanny business savvy and subtle understanding of the market kept Shakespeare and his company at the top his entire career. His motivation for understanding his demographic is hard to articulate exactly. The obvious reasons may have already been explained, but there may have been a more subtle drive in some of the defining circumstances of his life. Whatever his motivation, it is hardly debatable that he was a shrewd businessman, and in being so, he restored his family's fortune and perhaps their dignity. Trying to discern the distinctive factors that motivated Shakespeare's genius can only be speculative. Although the argument that his genius was motivated by defining circumstances, a unique approach to the theater, competition, and his remarkable business savvy is compelling, the question must remain rhetorical. There is no way to know for sure. Shakespeare had a definitive passion and expertise for his craft, and in the end, that's all that is certain. In his life, his plays impacted his audiences from the groundlings to royalty and kept them enthralled throughout his career. Perhaps the most fitting commentary to sum up the genius of Shakespeare came from one of his most fervent rivals, Ben Jonson, in an excerpt from the eulogy he wrote for Shakespeare. Of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome sent forth, or since did from their ashes come, triumph, my Bretagne, thou hast one to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time. Shakespeare has influenced the entire world with his writing in a way that perhaps will never be done again. Trying to understand the motivation for his genius is perhaps less important than realizing the common bonds of humanity his work reflected.